Nobody in Crescik had ever heard a dragon cry before. Noel heard it first, a sound from the high ridge that was not wind, not stones settling, not any animal he had put a name to in 26 years of living near those mountains. It was low and long, and it had grief in it the way a bell has metal in it. You didn't hear the grief so much as feel it move through you. He told his wife Petra. She told him to go back to sleep. He didn't sleep. By morning the sound was gone, but Noel was already at the ridge path with a coil of rope and a skinning knife, which was the only tool he owned that could pass for a weapon. Crescik was a salt village. They pulled mineral salt from the flat rock beds east of town and traded it south to the river cities. Not a fighting village, not even a particularly brave one. They survived by staying small and staying quiet and making sure the dragons overhead always had bigger concerns than whatever was happening in Crescik. The ridge path took an hour. When Noel reached the top, he stopped walking. The dragon was enormous, even lying down. Its scales were the color of old iron, dark gray and rust brown, and it was breathing in the shallow, catching way of something that had lost a great deal of blood. One of its rear legs was folded wrong, not broken, torn. Something had taken a piece of it, something with teeth or metal strong enough to do what nothing in Crescik's experience could do to a dragon. It lifted its head when Noel didn't run. He didn't run because his legs didn't decide to. They just stayed where they were while his mind caught up. The dragon's eyes were amber. They were also unmistakably exhausted, not angry, not calculating, just tired in the specific way of a creature that has been fighting for too long and has just run out of road. Noel said, "Are you going to kill me?" The dragon stared at him. Its nostrils flared once. "I'll take that as uncertain," Noel said. He sat down on a flat rock about 12 feet away. He had a piece of salt bread in his coat that he'd brought for the walk. He ate half of it. The dragon watched him chew. He said, "My name's Noel. I heard you last night." The dragon said nothing. Dragons didn't speak to humans. Everyone knew that. It wasn't a law, just a fact, the way it was a fact that rivers ran south and harvests failed in dry years. Humans were small and brief and not worth the sound. Noel finished the bread. He looked at the torn leg. The wound had crusted over, but the flesh around it was wrong, swollen, hot-looking, the kind of damage that goes quiet before it goes bad. He had seen the same thing in horses. He knew what happened next if you left it. He stood up. "I'm going to go get something. I'll come back." He walked back down to Crescik. He went to old Vera, who kept the medicine stores and had set more bones than anyone else in the village, and complained about it constantly. He told her he had found an injured animal on the ridge. He did not specify. Vera gave him a clay jar of drawing salve and a length of linen and told him not to waste it on something already dead. He went back up. The dragon was still there. It had not moved. When it saw him coming, it made a sound in its chest, not the grief sound from last night, something shorter, more uncertain, and it watched him cross the ridge to within 6 feet of its injured leg. Noel crouched and looked at the wound. "This is going to hurt," he said. He wasn't sure why he kept talking, possibly because silence felt worse, possibly because if he stopped, he would start thinking about the size of the teeth in that jaw and what they could do to a man in under a second. He applied the salve. His hands didn't shake until after he was done, which he considered a reasonable arrangement. The dragon made no sound during it. It held still with the rigidity of a creature that had decided, for reasons of its own, to permit this. When Noel wrapped the linen, and it took nearly the whole length, the wound was enormous. The dragon lowered its head to the ground and exhaled. The breath was hot enough that Noel felt it on his face from 4 feet away. Not fire, just heat, something releasing. He sat back down on his flat rock. "I don't know what hurt you," he said, "and I don't suppose you'll tell me, but if you stay up here with that leg, you're going to lose it." He paused. "I don't know if dragons lose legs and survive. Maybe you do. You're a lot bigger than a horse." The dragon looked at him. "I'll come back tomorrow," Noel said. "I'll bring more salve, and probably more bread, because it turns out I find bread helpful in situations like this." He went home. Petra asked if he'd found what made the noise. He said he had. She asked what it was. Something that needed help, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She had been married to him for 7 years, and she knew his face the way she knew the shape of the salt beds, every line of it. How much trouble is this going to be? She asked. Noel thought about the amber eyes, the wound, the sound that had moved through him in the dark like a bell. A fair amount, he said honestly. Vera figured it out on the 3rd day. She had been suspicious since the first. A man didn't use half a jar of drawing salve on a deer, and when Noel came back for the 2nd jar, she watched his hands while he talked. People's hands told you what their mouths were working around. His was steady, but his knuckles were clean in a way that meant he'd scrubbed them carefully, and there was a faint singeing on the left cuff of his coat. Nothing in Cressick ran hot enough to singe wool. Nothing natural anyway. She packed the 2nd jar and an extra length of linen and her own coat, and followed him at a distance she had spent 60 years perfecting. She'd followed cheating husbands, runaway children, men who said they were going to the South Field and went somewhere else entirely. She knew how to be unnoticed. She stopped at the ridgeline. The dragon was sitting up. Its injured leg was extended, the linen wrapping dark with old salve and use, and it was watching Noel the way Vera had seen dogs watch people who fed them, not with submission, but with the specific attention of a creature deciding whether to trust. Noel was crouched beside the leg again, working. He was talking. She couldn't hear the words, just the tone, steady, low, the voice you used with animals in pain. The dragon's tail moved, slowly, not a threat, the way a cat's tail moved when it was settling. Vera stood at the ridgeline for a long time. Then she turned around and walked back down to Cressick and went to see Petra. Petra poured 2 cups of the weak tea that was all they had this late in the season and sat down across from her and said, "You saw." "I saw," Vera said. "Are you going to tell someone?" Vera picked up her cup. "Who would I tell? The river merchants? The southern lords who haven't sent soldiers this far north in 15 years? She drank. The dragon chose this ridge to come to when it was hurt. It could have gone anywhere. It came here." Petra said, "Noel thinks it couldn't go anywhere else. It's been hurt badly. He thinks it came here because it had no other choice." "Maybe," Vera said, "but it's let him touch it 3 days running. That's not a creature with no options. That's a creature making one." She put down the cup. She thought about what she'd seen, the tail moving, the particular stillness of the dragon's body while Noel worked. She had set enough bones to know what something looked like when it was surrendering to being helped. She said, "I want to come tomorrow." Petra stared at her. "You're 63. I'm aware. It could kill you in a second. Most things can at my age. I still get out of bed." Noel didn't argue when Vera came up the path behind him the next morning. He'd known her long enough to understand that arguing with Vera was a way of talking to yourself for a while before she did what she'd already decided. He said only, "Stay behind me until I say different." Vera stayed behind him. The dragon looked at her when she stepped onto the ridge. Its amber eyes tracked from Noel to this new small human and held there. Vera did not step back. She stood with the posture she used when she had to deliver bad news, square, still, meeting whatever came. The dragon exhaled slowly through its nose. Vera said, "I've been healing things for 40 years, and I have never seen a wound like that one dressed properly from below. You need a poultice, not just salve. The swelling won't go down otherwise." Noel looked at her. "It can't understand you." "Then I'm talking to myself, which I do anyway." She moved to the leg slowly, making no sudden motions. "Pass me the jar." The dragon did not move while she worked. She was quicker than Noel and more precise. Her hands had done this 10,000 times in smaller scale, and the principle was the same. She talked while she worked, the way she always talked while she worked. A low, running commentary about what she was doing and why, addressed to nobody in particular. The dragon's breathing stayed even. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked up at the dragon's face. "You're going to need at least 2 more weeks before that leg holds weight," she said. "So either you stay up here and we keep coming, or you try to fly and tear it open again and we never see you again." She paused. Your choice, but if you stay, you have my word we won't bring anyone who means you harm. That's all I can offer. A 63-year-old woman's word. The dragon looked at her. Then it lowered its great head to the ground, not falling, choosing, and closed its eyes. Noel looked at Vera. Was that a yes? He asked. That, Vera said, standing slowly and pressing a hand to her knee, was an exhausted creature that has just decided to let two humans take care of it. She picked up her bag. Which means tomorrow you carry both jars. My back is not what it used to be. They walked back down together. Behind them, on the ridge, the dragons slept. Below in Kresic, the salt beds ran east in their flat grey lines, ordinary and permanent. Nothing had changed. And yet something had, in the way that small decisions make their marks in invisible places, and you only see the shape of it later when you look back. The problem arrived on a horse, wearing a green coat. His name was Fenton, and he was the tax assessor for the Southern Lords, which made him the most disliked man in 6 villages and the best fed. He came to Kresic every season to count the salt yield and take his portion and make notes about everything he observed, because the Southern Lords liked to know things about the places that fed their coffers. He had sharp eyes and a habit of walking where he wasn't invited. He saw the burn marks on Noel's coat cuff. He saw the fresh linen in Vera's supply room, or rather, the gap where fresh linen had been. He saw the ridge path worn down more than foot traffic usually wore it this time of year, when the cold kept most of Kresic indoors. He sat across from Noel at the table that evening and said, "There's a rumor from the North Road. Travelers saying they saw a dragon come down in the high ridge 2 weeks ago. Injured, never came back up." Noel poured him tea. Travelers see a lot of things. They do, Fenton said. He wrapped his hands around the cup. A living dragon on this ridge, an injured one, a stationary one, would be worth a great deal to certain people. The Southern Lords have 3 dragon hunters on retainer, specialists. They've been looking for one that can't outfly them. The room went very still. Noel set down the kettle. He said, "The dragon hasn't harmed anyone in Kresic." "That's not the point of dragon hunters." "No," Noel said, "it's not." He sat down. He looked at Fenton directly, and Fenton was a man who had stared down a lot of people across tables, and he found, to his own mild surprise, that the Saltburner's gaze was harder to meet than most. "If you send word to those hunters, you'll get them here in 4 days, maybe 5, and by then I'll have told every person in this village what the Southern Lords sent north." Fenton said, "That's not a threat that changes much for me." "It doesn't have to change anything for you," Noel said, "but Kresic's salt goes south on barges. 42 people load and unload those barges. Word that the Lords send hunters to kill injured animals on a village's ridge. That kind of word travels with every barge that pushes off. You know how river cities talk." Fenton was quiet. He was a practical man. Practicality was the engine of every calculation he made. He said, "You're protecting it." "I'm protecting this village," Noel said. "Same thing right now." Fenton left the next morning without sending any messages. Whether that was conscience or calculation, Noel never knew. He didn't ask. Some gifts came without explanations, and it was better not to shake them apart. But that same morning, a second problem arrived. Not a person, a sound from the ridge, not the grief sound from the first night, something different, shorter, repeated, urgent. Noel ran. He hadn't run on the ridge path before, and his legs reminded him he was 26 years old and not 17, but he reached the top in 40 minutes instead of 60. The dragon was on its feet. The injured leg was taking weight badly, the dragon's whole body tilting to compensate, and it was facing south with its neck extended and its eyes locked on something in the southern sky that Noel couldn't see for another 10 seconds. Then he saw it, 2 shapes, high up, moving fast. Scouts, dragon scouts, from the coloring, dark red, built lean, the kind of dragons that flew for a lord's flight and reported back. They had seen the ridge dragon. They banked and circled. The ridge dragon made the urgent sound again, not to the scouts. Noel realized with a cold jolt that it was making the sound at him. He looked at the dragon, at the leg, at the two scouts circling lower. He didn't think about it for long. There wasn't time. He stepped forward and put himself directly in front of the dragon, between it and the sky, and he spread his arms wide, both of them, like the salt markers they put up on the beds when a section was claimed. He looked up at the circling scouts, and he shouted. Not words, just sound, loud and sharp and human and present. The scouts pulled back. Not from fear, nothing about Noel was frightening to a dragon, but something about the sight of it gave them pause. A human standing in front of an injured dragon with arms out, making noise. It wasn't a thing that happened. It wasn't a thing the scouts had encountered or had any framework for processing. They circled twice more at a higher altitude, then they moved south. Noel lowered his arms. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his ears. He turned around. The dragon was looking at him with its amber eyes from 3 feet away, and he realized it had moved while he was shouting, moved closer, not away. It was standing directly behind him. He said, breathing hard, I don't know if that worked. The dragon lowered its head until its jaw was level with his shoulder. It made a sound he hadn't heard before, low, brief, with a different texture than any sound before it. He didn't know the dragon's language. He had no way of knowing what it meant. But the feeling it left in him was something like, I see you. He put his hand on the side of its jaw. Yeah, he said quietly, I see you too. The scouts came back, not 2-8. They arrived at dawn 6 days later, and this time they didn't circle. They landed on the wide southern face of the ridge in a formation Noel had no word for but understood instinctively as deliberate, spread out, no gaps, completely blocking the southern descent. The ridge dragon was between them and the northern drop, which was sheer rock and a very long fall. They hadn't come to fight. If they'd come to fight, there would have been more of them, and they wouldn't have bothered with formation. They'd come to talk, or rather, one of them had, and the other 7 were making sure the conversation happened on their terms. The one that stepped forward was larger than the scouts, older, its scales a deeper red that had faded at the edges to the color of dried blood. It had a scar across its left eye. The eye still worked, but the scar had been put there by something that had come very close to ending it. It looked at the ridge dragon for a long moment, then it looked at Noel. The look lasted longer than Noel was comfortable with. Then the old dragon spoke, not in the common tongue. In the dragon language, the deep resonant frequencies that moved through the chest. The ridge dragon answered, back and forth, for several minutes, while Noel stood to the side and watched and understood nothing and felt every second of it. Then the old dragon looked at him again, and it spoke in the common tongue, in a voice like stone breaking underground. It said, "You are the human." Noel said, "I'm a human, there are many. You are the one who has been tending this wound." "Yes." "Why?" "Not how, not when, why?" Noel had thought about what he would say if this moment came. He had rehearsed several answers, all of them reasonable. He found, standing here, that none of them were actually true. He said, "She was hurt, and she was alone, and I knew how to help." The old dragon was very still. "She. That's how I think of her," Noel said. "I don't know if it's right, I don't have another word." The old dragon looked back at the ridge dragon. Something passed between them that Noel couldn't read. The old dragon said, "Her name in your tongue would take more breath than you have in your body. We do not share names with small creatures." It turned back to Noel. "She is a flight daughter. Her father leads 47 in the southern range. She was taken 3 weeks ago by hunters, men with chain weapons who knew where she would be flying. She was brought down and they tried to take her alive. She broke free. The damage was done in the breaking." Noel looked at the leg. He thought about the wound, the way it was torn, not cut, the effort it would take to do that kind of damage to a dragon. "The chain weapons," he said. "Someone sent for dragon hunters, and she was the target." The old dragon said nothing, which was an answer. Noel thought of Fenton's green coat and his sharp eyes. He said, "I had a man here, tax man from the southern lords. He knew she was on the ridge." He paused. "I thought I'd convinced him to stay quiet." He was quiet, the old dragon said. His lord was not. Dragon hunters came to us 2 days ago to sell information. We came here instead. Silence on the ridge, the wind ran through it. The old dragon said, "You have cared for a flight daughter of a lord's line for 3 weeks. In that time, you drove off 2 scouts with your hands and your voice. You threatened a lord's servant with economic consequence." It paused. "These are not the acts of an insignificant creature." Noel said, "I'm a salt burner. I'm as insignificant as it gets." "What you are," the old dragon said slowly, as if finding the words in a language it did not usually bother with, "is persistent. We had a word for it once. In the old tongue, it meant something like water over rock, not strong, but present, always present, until the rock is different." The ridge dragon made a sound. The old dragon listened to it. Then it said to Noel, "She says you talked to her when she was afraid." Noel said, "I talk when I'm nervous. It helps me more than it helps anyone else." "She says it helped her." He didn't know what to do with that. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the ground for a moment, because that was the only place to look that wasn't enormous and scaled and waiting. Then he said, "What happens now, to her I mean, if the hunters know where she is?" "We take her home," the old dragon said. "2 more days for the leg, then she flies." "And the hunters?" "The hunters will be addressed." The finality of that phrase closed the subject entirely. The 8 scouts moved to the ridge edges, no longer a barrier, now a perimeter, guarding the space. The old dragon settled onto the rock and did not speak again. The ridge dragon crossed the space between herself and Noel and stood close to him, not touching, just near. Noel looked up at her. She looked down at him. He said, "I'm glad you didn't die in that ravine." She made the sound he had come to think of as hers, the one he still didn't have words for. He sat down on his flat rock, and she lowered her head to the ground beside him, and they stayed there until the light changed, as they had done every day for 3 weeks, which was not a long time in the measure of dragons, but was, in its own way, enough. On the morning of the second day, the hunters came anyway. 14 of them, mounted, which was unusual. Most dragon hunters worked on foot because horses lost their minds around dragons, but these men had animals bred for it, trained down to a kind of blank obedience that was almost worse than fear. They carried chain lances on their backs, long poles weighted with iron mesh on coiled springs. Noel had never seen one, but he understood from the shape what it was for. They came up the north path. Noel didn't know there was a north path. Apparently the hunters did. He heard them before he saw them, the particular ring of iron gear on stone, the sound of large men being deliberate about their noise because they wanted to be heard. A warning. "Move aside," it said. "This is professional." Noel was standing at the ridge when they crested the top. The 8 scouts were there. The old dragon was there. The ridge dragon was there, on her feet, her legs still wrong, but her weight distributed differently than 2 days ago, better, almost right. The lead hunter pulled up his horse and looked at the situation on the ridge and recalculated visibly. He'd expected 1 injured dragon. He had not expected 9. But the hunters were professionals, and professionals don't leave for the first number they planned around. The lead hunter looked past the dragons, past the scouts, and found Noel. He pointed with his lance. "You're the one who sent word off the ridge. We know it was you." Noel said, "You have the wrong man. We were hired to take that one." He gestured with the lance at the ridge dragon. "Contract with Lord Dunwell, paid in advance. I don't leave a paid contract." Noel looked at the 14 hunters. He looked at the 8 scouts. He looked at the old dragon, whose scarred eye was fixed on the lead hunter with an expression Noel could now read because he'd spent weeks studying the face of a creature very like this one. The expression said, "One word from me." He knew what would happen if that word came. The hunters would die. Some of the scouts might die too if the chain lances got off. It would be fast, and it would be total, and the ridge would be a different color by the end of it. He stepped between them. Again, the same as with the scouts, same arms, same position. Different situation because these men had weapons and intent, and a contract with a lord's seal. The lead hunter stared at him. Move. Noel said, Lord Dunwell hired you to take that dragon. Yes. Lord Dunwell, Noel said, sent a taxman to Cressick 2 months ago. Fenton, you know him. A pause, shorter than it should have been. The lead hunter knew him. Lord Dunwell told Fenton to find an injured dragon on this ridge. So Fenton came here with his sharp eyes and his green coat, and he counted the salt yield, and he sent word south. And that's how you have a contract. This is not relevant to the contract, the lead hunter said. The Dragon Hunters Guild has a code, Noel said. I know it because I looked it up last night in a merchant's almanac Vera keeps for winter reading. He had, in fact, spent 4 hours in the cold with a lamp finding the right page. His eyes still ached. Code 7. No contract is valid if the target was identified through means that put civilians at risk. Fenton works in Cressick. There are 42 people in Cressick. If Fenton's information gathering put any of us at risk, the contract is voidable. Silence. The lead hunter said, you read a Hunters Guild code from a merchant's almanac. It was a very thorough almanac. The man stared at him. He was not a stupid man. He turned the code in his head the way Noel could visibly see him doing it, testing its edges, finding where it held. He found where it held. His jaw tightened. That clause requires a guild arbitration. It doesn't void the contract on the field. I know, Noel said. So here's the situation. You can push through me and take the dragon and complete the contract, and 9 dragons will address that decision. Or you can file for guild arbitration on the grounds of a Code 7, which freezes the contract while it's heard, which means you're not in breach of anything for walking off this ridge today. The lead hunter looked at his men. He looked at the scouts. He looked at the old dragon, who had not moved, who was still watching him with that amber patience that had no floor and no ceiling. He looked at Noel. Who taught you to negotiate? He said. Nobody, Noel said. I'm a salt burner. I'm figuring it out as I go. The lead hunter was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. He said to his men without looking at them, Code 7, we're filing. They went back down the north path. The iron ring of their gear faded and was gone. Noel lowered his arms. He turned around. Every dragon on the ridge was looking at him. The old dragon said, you read a guild code. Last night, yes. For her. Noel shrugged. Someone had to. The ridge dragon crossed the space between them and pressed the side of her jaw to the top of his head. Not hard, carefully. The heat of her was enormous and immediate. He stood very still inside it. The old dragon said nothing for a while. Then, water over rock. Maybe, Noel said, he could feel the vibration of the ridge dragons breathing through the top of his skull. Or maybe, I just hate it when powerful people decide something that isn't theirs to decide. The old dragon made a sound. It took Noel a moment to understand that it was laughing. She left on a Thursday because the wind was right. Noel knew it before she moved. She'd been tilting her head into the wind since dawn, the way she did when something in the air told her something. The leg was holding. Not perfect. It would never be perfectly even again, but it held her weight and it would hold the sky. Vera had said so the day before in the particular tone she used when she was certain but didn't want anyone celebrating too early. The 8 scouts had been on the ridge for 2 days, resting, waiting. The old dragon hadn't left. Noel had gotten the impression, without anyone explaining it, that the old dragon was not going to leave without seeing this through, whatever this was. Noel came up the ridge path with bread and salt pork and set it on the flat rock the way he had every morning for 3 weeks. He sat down. The ridge dragon came from the north face, where she slept and stood near him, and he ate his bread, and she ate the pork, and the wind came across the ridge the way it always did, cold and flat and smelling like high rock. He didn't say what he was feeling. It was too large, and he wasn't good with large things that lived inside the chest. He just sat with her and ate his bread and let the morning be what it was. The old dragon spoke. Her father wants to see you. Noel looked up. Me. He received our account of what happened here. He asked that the human be brought south. I'm not going to be brought anywhere, Noel said, not angrily, just clearly. Brought, the old dragon said, was a poor word. He asked that the human be invited. Noel thought about that. A lord dragon wants to meet me. Yes, because I fed his daughter salt pork and applied drawing salve to her leg. The old dragon said, because you stood on a ridge with no weapon and no flight and no reason that any creature of power would recognize, and you put your body between her and harm. Twice. Not because you expected reward, not because you were commanded to, because it was the right thing and you were the only one there to do it. Noel was quiet for a moment. I'm not special, he said. There are people in Cressick who would have done the same. Perhaps, the old dragon said, but they were not here, you were. He thought about what it would mean to go south. He thought about Petra and the salt beds and the long winter coming. He thought about what Vera would say, which would be several things at once, most of them involving his common sense or lack thereof. He said, "Can I have a few days?" "Yes." He looked at the ridge dragon. She was looking south. There was something in her posture that he had learned to read, not impatience, something more like readiness, the held breath before a step. He recognized it because he felt it himself sometimes, looking at the path down to Cressick, knowing that whatever came next started the moment he moved. He said, "I need to ask you something before you go." She looked at him. He said, "Were you afraid when I first came down into that ravine?" She made a sound. The old dragon listened to it and said, "She says, yes. She was afraid of you and she was afraid of what you would do, but you sat down, you ate bread, you talked." She had never had a creature sit down next to her in fear and stay anyway. Noel looked at the ground. "I didn't stay because I wasn't afraid. I stayed because leaving felt worse." The old dragon was quiet. Then it said, and its voice was different this time, less like stone, more like something old admitting something it had not said before. "That is the thing we do not understand about your kind. Fear does not stop you. You feel it and you move through it, and we have never had a word for that because we never believed it was real." A pause. "We believed humans overcame fear only when the reward was large enough. It took a salt burner with bread in his pocket to show us that some of you do it for nothing, because the situation asks it." The wind came across the ridge. The ridge dragon moved. She walked to the north edge, the edge with the drop, and she spread her wings, both of them. The left one clicked at the joint and held. The scouts moved to the air without a sound, organized, quiet, the way something practiced looks. The old dragon rose last. She looked back at Noel from the edge. He stood up from his flat rock. He raised his hand, not a wave, something more like the salt markers. "I was here. This was real." She stepped off the edge. She dropped for one terrible second, and then the wings caught and she rose, and the morning light came through her wingspan, and she was enormous, and she was whole, and she was going home. Noel watched until all 9 dragons were too high to see clearly, then longer, until the sky was just sky. He picked up his bread and walked back down to Cressick. Petra was at the doorway. She had been watching the ridge. Her hands were folded, which meant she had been standing there a while. He walked past her and she said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Are you all right?" He thought about it, honestly. "Yes," he said, "I think so." She nodded. She put the kettle on. He sat down at the table and looked at his hands, the singe on his coat cuff, the calluses from 3 weeks of ridge climbing, small marks, the kind of marks that nobody looking at him would read as the evidence of anything. He thought about what the old dragon had said, water over rock, not strong, present, until the rock is different. He thought, the rock is already different. He thought, I just don't know what shape it'll be yet. He picked up his tea, and he waited to find out.